The rope. The rope coiled at the base of the destroyed bunker looked innocent enough in the grey dawn light, filtering through the smoke above Hacksaw Ridge. Desmond Doss crouched beside it, testing each strand with his fingers, feeling for weak spots where the fibers might part under the weight of a man. The 77th Infantry Division had been holding the top of this coral plateau for 3 days, and the Japanese defenders below had made every hour a study in endurance and faith. "You sure that thing will hold, Doc?" Private Morrison asked, his rifle cradled across his knees as he watched Doss work. Morrison had been one of the loudest voices during training back in the States, calling Doss a coward for refusing to carry a weapon. Now, after seeing what the medic did under fire, Morrison's tone carried something closer to reverent worry. "It'll hold," Doss replied quietly, though his own doubts gnawed at him. The rope was army surplus, meant for hauling equipment, not lowering wounded men down a 100-foot cliff face, but it was what they had, and down in the valley below, the aid station waited with doctors, plasma, and real surgical tables instead of muddy shell holes. The ridge stretched behind them like a moonscape of shattered coral and splintered trees. 3 days of artillery had turned the plateau into a maze of craters, each one potentially hiding Japanese soldiers who had retreated into the extensive cave system beneath the ridge. The official plan had been simple: take the high ground, dig in, and push forward. Reality had proven considerably more complex. Lieutenant Harrison appeared through the smoke, his uniform torn and stained with 3 days of mud and worse things. "Doss, we're pulling back to reorganize. The assault on the caves is postponed until we get armor support up those slopes." Doss looked up from the rope, his hands still testing knots. "What about the wounded still up here, sir? We've accounted for everyone in the fallback positions. Anyone who can move is already heading down with the company." Harrison's voice carried the weight of a man who had been making impossible decisions for 72 hours straight. But even as the lieutenant spoke, a voice drifted across the scarred plateau from somewhere near the forward edge of their positions. "Medic! Jesus! Somebody help me!" Morrison flinched at the sound. "That's coming from way up by the Japanese positions, Lieutenant. Whoever that is, he's past the perimeter we've been holding." Harrison closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Doss could see the calculation there, the brutal arithmetic of combat leadership. "We can't risk more men for stragglers who went too far forward. The order is to fall back. That's final." The cry came again, weaker this time. "Help me, please." Doss stood slowly, the rope still in his hands. Around them, the rest of the company was already moving toward the cargo nets and improvised ladders that led down the cliff face to safety. Men picked up equipment, helped wounded buddies, and cast nervous glances toward the cave mouths where muzzle flashes had been winking all morning. "Sir, I request permission to remain behind and assist any casualties who haven't been evacuated yet." Harrison stared at him. "Doss, that's not a request I can approve. You heard the same briefing I did. Intelligence estimates at least 2 companies of Japanese defenders still operational in those caves. They're just waiting for us to get careless. And then they won't be expecting one man with a medical bag and no rifle," Doss said quietly. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, gripping his rifle tighter. "Doc, this is crazy. Even for you, this is crazy." But Doss was already checking his aid bag, inventorying bandages, morphine, and field dressings. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing this work since the division landed on Okinawa. But Harrison noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, the only sign that beneath the calm exterior, Doss was as scared as any of them. "I can't order you to stay, and I can't order anyone else to stay with you," Harrison said finally. "But I can tell you that if you're not down in 30 minutes, we have to assume you're not coming down at all." The lieutenant turned and walked away, leaving Doss alone with Morrison and the rope that might soon be the only thing standing between wounded men and death. Morrison stood slowly, shouldering his rifle. "You know I think you're completely insane, right, Doc?" "I know. And you know I can't stay up here with you because I got a wife and kids back in Ohio, and they need their daddy to come home in one piece. I know that too. Morrison extended his hand, and Doss shook it. Then I guess I'll see you at the bottom of that cliff, one way or another. As Morrison's footsteps faded toward the evacuation point, Doss found himself alone on Hacksaw Ridge, with only the sound of distant artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle to keep him company. He tied one end of the rope around the concrete base of the destroyed bunker and tested the knot 3 times before he was satisfied. Somewhere out there in the maze of shell holes and broken trees, wounded men were waiting for help that might never come, unless one man with a prayer and a fraying rope decided that 30 minutes was long enough to find just one more. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first wounded man Doss found was Private Coleman, sprawled behind a shattered tree stump about 50 yards from the cliff edge. Coleman's legs were mangled from a mortar blast, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about his mother's apple pie back in Tennessee. Blood had soaked through his uniform trousers, but he was still breathing, still fighting. Doss knelt beside him and began working with swift, practiced movements. Veal dressing around the worst wounds, a shot of morphine, and then the delicate process of fashioning a stretcher from Coleman's shelter, half and 2 broken rifle stocks he found scattered nearby. The work required him to stay exposed for nearly 10 minutes, and twice he had to freeze as machine gun bursts swept across the plateau from hidden positions. Where is everybody?" Coleman whispered when the morphine brought him back to partial consciousness. "They pulled back to regroup," Doss said, not mentioning that he was supposed to have gone with them. "But you're getting out of here. I promise you that." The journey back to the rope took 20 minutes of careful movement, staying low and using crater holes for cover. Coleman was heavier than he looked, and Doss's shoulders screamed with fatigue by the time they reached the cliff edge. Below, he could see the staging area where medics waited with proper stretchers and plasma bags. Rigging the rope system proved more complex than Doss had anticipated. He needed to secure Coleman to the improvised stretcher in a way that would keep him stable during the descent, while also ensuring the rope wouldn't slip or tangle on the coral outcroppings that jutted from the cliff face. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, but from the exhaustion that was already settling into his bones. The rope held. Coleman disappeared over the edge and reached the bottom safely, where other medics quickly untied him and carried him toward the aid station. But as Doss hauled the rope back up, he heard another voice calling from somewhere deeper on the plateau. "Help! Oh God, is somebody there?" This one was Corporal Mitchell, trapped in a shell crater with a jagged piece of shrapnel through his shoulder. Mitchell was semi-conscious and kept talking about his wife in California, describing their small apartment and the job waiting for him at the aircraft plant. The wound was bad, but not immediately life-threatening if Doss could get him evacuated quickly. "I thought everyone left," Mitchell whispered as Doss wrapped the shoulder wound. "I thought I was going to die up here alone." "Nobody gets left behind," Doss replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself anymore. His aid bag was already running low on supplies, and each trip back to the cliff edge took longer as fatigue accumulated in his legs and shoulders. But the rope held for Mitchell too, and then for Private Baker, who had taken shrapnel in both legs and had been wedged between 2 fallen trees for hours. Baker was one of the men who had mocked Doss most loudly during training, calling him yellow for refusing to carry a weapon. Now Baker gripped Doss's sleeve with desperate gratitude. "I'm sorry, Doc," Baker whispered as the field dressing went around his thigh. "All that stuff I said about you being a coward. I'm sorry. Don't worry about that now. We need to get you down to the doctors." As Baker disappeared over the cliff, Doss realized he had lost track of time. The sun was setting behind the smoke, and Lieutenant Harrison's 30-minute deadline had passed hours ago. By now, the company would be assuming he was dead. But scattered across the plateau, more voices continued calling for help. The rope was beginning to show signs of wear. Individual fibers had started to fray near the anchor point where it rubbed against the concrete bunker, and Doss found himself inspecting it carefully before each use. He estimated it was good for maybe a dozen more trips, if his strength held out, if he didn't make a mistake with the knots, if a sniper's bullet didn't cut the line. Private Gonzalez was next, barely alive with shrapnel in his chest. Then Sergeant Williams, with a head wound that had left him confused and babbling about baseball scores from 1943. Two young replacements, whose names Doss had never learned. Lieutenant Peterson, who had led the final assault wave before taking a bullet through the stomach. Each time, the rope held. Each time, Doss whispered the same prayer. "Lord, please help me find just one more." But as darkness settled over Hacksaw Ridge and the voices calling from the plateau began to fade, Doss realized that the easy rescues were finished. The men still up here were deeper in Japanese territory, closer to the cave mouths, in positions where a single man with no weapon would be walking into almost certain death. He tested the rope one more time, feeling the weakened fibers shift under his fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a new voice cried out. Young, desperate, probably one of the replacement soldiers who had arrived just days before the assault. Doss checked his watch, though he could barely read the hands in the gathering darkness. He had been doing this for 8 hours. His water was gone, his morphine was nearly depleted, and every muscle in his body felt like it was tearing. But that voice in the darkness was calling his name. "Medic, please! Is that you, Doss?" He coiled the rope carefully and started moving toward the sound, deeper into Japanese territory than any American soldier had any right to survive. Behind him, the cliff edge disappeared into shadow. Ahead lay only prayer, stubbornness, and the quiet determination to find just one more wounded man before the night was through. The voice belonged to Private Harrison, no relation to the lieutenant, a 19-year-old from Iowa who had been with the division for exactly 6 days. Doss found him curled up inside a collapsed Japanese bunker, bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds and barely conscious. His left arm hung at an impossible angle, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. "I knew you'd come back," Harrison whispered when he saw Doss crawling toward him through the rubble. "The other guys said you always come back." Doss used the last of his morphine and wrapped what remained of his bandages around the worst wounds. The kid was in bad shape, but he was breathing, and his pulse was steady. With care and luck, he might survive long enough to reach the aid station below. The journey back to the cliff took nearly an hour. They had to move in short bursts, waiting for machine gun sweeps to pass and listening for the sound of Japanese voices from the cave systems. Twice, Doss had to drag the unconscious private into shell holes and wait while enemy patrols moved past their position in the darkness. By the time they reached the rope anchor point, Doss could see that the line was down to its final threads. The constant friction against the coral cliff face had worn through more than half the strands, and what remained looked ready to snap under any serious weight. "This might not hold," he whispered to Harrison, though the private was unconscious and couldn't hear him. "But it's what we've got." He rigged the stretcher with extra care, distributing Harrison's weight as evenly as possible and using every knot he knew to secure the connections. As the private disappeared over the cliff edge, Doss held his breath and listened to the rope stretching and creaking under the load. For a terrifying moment, individual fibers snapped and curled back against his palms like broken guitar strings. The rope stretched beyond what seemed safe, and Doss found himself praying more desperately than he had all day. "Please, Lord, just hold together for one more minute." The rope held. Barely. When Doss hauled the line back up, he could see that it was finished. Maybe one more trip, if he was lucky, and if he didn't weigh too much for the remaining fibers. After that, anyone left on the ridge would have to wait for the engineers to rig a new line in the morning. He sat down heavily against the destroyed bunker and tried to inventory the situation. His water was gone. His medical supplies were exhausted. His hands were raw and bleeding from rope burns, and his shoulders felt like someone had been beating them with hammers for 8 hours, which, in a sense, someone had. But the ridge had gone quiet. No more voices calling for help, no more cries of medic drifting through the smoke and darkness. Either he had found everyone, or the men still out there were beyond help. Doss closed his eyes and tried to remember the faces of all the men he had lowered down the cliff. Coleman with his mangled legs, Mitchell talking about his wife, Baker, who had apologized for calling him a coward, Gonzalez, Williams, Peterson, the 2 replacements, young Harrison from Iowa. How many was that? He had lost count somewhere around number 15, when exhaustion and adrenaline had blurred the individual rescues into one long, continuous prayer. 20? 25? The medics at the bottom would have an accurate count, but up here in the darkness, the numbers didn't seem to matter as much as the individual faces. A new sound drifted across the plateau. Not a cry for help, but something else. Voices speaking Japanese, coming from somewhere near the cave mouths. A patrol, probably, or guards checking the perimeter. Doss pressed himself against the bunker wall and tried to make himself invisible. The voices passed within 30 yards of his position, close enough that he could hear their equipment rattling and their boots scraping against coral rock. For a moment he wondered what they made of the rope rigged over the cliff edge, whether they understood what had been happening on their plateau all day. When the patrol moved on, Doss found himself thinking about Lieutenant Harrison and the rest of the company, safe now in the staging area below. They would be writing reports, tallying casualties, and planning tomorrow's assault. Someone would have to note that Medic Desmond Doss had remained on Hacksaw Ridge past the evacuation order and was presumed dead. Except he wasn't dead. Not yet. He tested the rope one final time, feeling the few remaining strands shift under pressure. It might hold his weight for a descent if he was careful and if he didn't put any sudden stress on the line. But it definitely wouldn't support another wounded man, which meant that if there was someone else up here, someone he had missed in his sweep of the plateau, that man would have to wait until morning for rescue. The thought sat heavy in Doss's stomach, heavier than hunger or thirst or exhaustion. But as he prepared to rappel down the cliff himself, a new sound reached his ears. Faint, almost lost in the distant rumble of artillery hitting Japanese positions to the north, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent months on the front lines. The sound of someone crying, trying to muffle the noise but not quite succeeding. Somewhere out there in the maze of shell holes and broken trees, one more wounded man was still alive. Doss looked at the rope, at the cliff edge, at the relative safety waiting below. Then he looked back toward the sound of crying, deeper in Japanese territory than any rational man would go. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The crying led Doss to a shell crater near the forward edge of what had been American positions before the withdrawal. Inside, he found Private Thompson, a replacement who had arrived with Harrison just days earlier, curled up with both legs shattered by the same mortar blast that had created the hole. Thompson couldn't have been older than 18, and when he saw Doss sliding down into the crater, he started sobbing with relief. "I thought I was dead," Thompson whispered. "I thought everybody forgot about me." Doss had no more morphine, no more proper bandages, nothing but torn strips from his own uniform shirt and the field experience to know what might keep Thompson alive long enough to matter. He worked by feel in the darkness, splinting the broken legs with pieces of shattered rifle stock and wrapping the wounds with improvised dressings. "We're gonna get you out of here," Doss said quietly, though he had no idea how. The rope back at the cliff was down to its final strands, barely capable of supporting his own weight, much less a wounded man on a stretcher. But as he worked, an idea began forming. Dangerous, probably suicidal, but possible if everything went exactly right and if Thompson was lighter than he looked. Instead of rigging a stretcher, Doss secured Thompson to his own body using strips of canvas and parachute cord salvaged from scattered equipment. The private would ride piggyback during the journey to the cliff, then stay tied to Doss during the descent. If the rope broke, they would fall together. If it held, they would both reach safety. "You sure about this, Doc?" Thompson whispered as Doss adjusted the improvised harness. "Maybe you should go down first and get help." "Nobody gets left behind," Doss replied. "We go together or not at all." The journey back to the rope took 2 hours. Thompson was small for a soldier, but carrying another man across broken ground while staying low enough to avoid sniper fire pushed Doss beyond any limit he had discovered in himself before. Twice he had to stop and rest, pressing his face into the mud while his back spasmed and his legs shook with exhaustion. Japanese patrols moved past them 3 times during the crossing. Once, enemy soldiers came so close that Doss could smell their cigarettes and hear them talking in low voices about the strange rope hanging over the American cliff. Thompson stayed silent through all of it, biting down on a piece of cloth to muffle any sound. When they finally reached the anchor point, Doss could see that the rope was worse than he had feared. More strands had parted during the night, probably from wind stress and the constant rubbing against coral outcroppings. What remained looked like it might support 50 pounds of dead weight, maybe 75 if the knots were perfect. Doss and Thompson together weighed nearly 300 pounds. "This is crazy," Thompson whispered, looking over the cliff edge at the drop that disappeared into darkness below. "This rope ain't gonna hold both of us." Doss tested the line one more time, feeling individual fibers snap under even minimal pressure. Thompson was right. The rope wouldn't hold their combined weight for a controlled descent, but it might support them long enough for something else, something so dangerous that Doss had never heard of anyone attempting it, even in the desperate situations that had become routine on Okinawa. Instead of a slow rappel, he would jump, not a free fall, but a controlled drop, using the rope as a brake to slow their descent just enough that they might survive hitting the ledges and outcroppings on the cliff face. If they were lucky, the rope would part gradually, rather than snapping all at once, giving them a few seconds to control their fall. "You ever been to a carnival, Thompson?" Doss asked as he adjusted their harness one final time. "Sure, Doc. Why? This is going to be like the scariest ride they ever built." Doss wrapped the rope around his forearm and gripped it with both hands, feeling the fibers cut into his already raw palms. Thompson's arms tightened around his neck, and for a moment they stood together at the edge of the cliff, 2 soldiers who had met 6 days ago, now trusting each other with their lives. "Lord, please let this work," Doss whispered. They jumped. For the first 20 feet the rope held, and their descent was almost controlled. Doss used his boots against the cliff face to push them away from the worst outcroppings, and Thompson stayed silent except for sharp intakes of breath when they bounced against coral ledges. Then the rope began parting strand by strand. Each broken fiber increased their speed and made the next impact harder. Doss felt his boots lose purchase against the rock face as they accelerated past what his technique could handle. Below them, the staging area grew larger, but still looked impossibly far away. "Hang on!" he shouted to Thompson, though there wasn't anything else either of them could do except fall and pray. The rope parted completely 30 feet from the bottom. They fell free for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 3 seconds, crashing through a canvas awning that someone had rigged over part of the aid station. The awning slowed them just enough that when they hit the ground, they were moving fast enough to hurt, but not fast enough to die. Doss felt Thompson's weight roll off his back as they came apart in the mud. Around them, medics and stretcher-bearers were shouting and running toward the impact site. Someone was shining a flashlight in his face and asking if he could hear them. "Thompson," he gasped, trying to sit up despite the pain shooting through his ribs. "Check on Thompson." "He's alive, Doc," a voice said nearby. "Busted up pretty good, but he's breathing." Doss closed his eyes and let his head fall back into the mud. Above them, Hacksaw Ridge loomed against the night sky, finally silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. No more voices calling for help, no more men waiting in shell holes for rescue that might never come. Just the sound of rain beginning to fall on canvas and the quiet voices of medics working over wounded soldiers in the darkness below the cliff. 3 days later, in a tent that served as the 77th Infantry Division's temporary headquarters, Lieutenant Harrison sat across from a clean-shaven colonel who had flown in from Corps headquarters to conduct after-action interviews. Between them lay a stack of preliminary reports, witness statements, and medical records that painted an almost unbelievable picture of what had happened on Hacksaw Ridge. 31 men, the colonel said, tapping the medical summary with his pen. Medic Doss evacuated 31 casualties from hostile territory over a period of approximately 10 hours, working alone and without weapon support. That's what the aid station logged, sir, Harrison replied. Though Doss himself claims he lost count somewhere around 20, the colonel leaned back in his folding chair and studied the young lieutenant. And you ordered the company to withdraw at 1800 hours, leaving Doss behind on his own initiative? Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I gave him a direct order to evacuate with the rest of the unit. He requested permission to remain behind and assist stragglers, but I told him no. I made it clear that anyone staying on the ridge after 30 minutes would be presumed KIA, but he stayed anyway. Yes, sir. The colonel made a note on his pad and moved to the next page of testimony. Private Morrison states that you were aware of Doss's religious objections to carrying weapons, and that there had been friction between him and other enlisted men during stateside training. Some of the men questioned his courage initially, Harrison admitted. A few made remarks about having a medic who wouldn't pick up a rifle if the situation required it. But after what happened on the ridge, sir, nobody's questioning Medic Doss anymore. What Harrison didn't mention, what he had omitted from his official report, and what he wasn't sure he would ever be able to discuss with anyone, was the moment when he had looked through his field glasses and seen a lone figure moving across the plateau in broad daylight, dragging wounded men toward the cliff edge, while Japanese snipers took shots at him. Harrison had spent 2 hours watching Doss work, expecting each moment to see him cut down by enemy fire. He had called up artillery support 3 times to suppress the cave positions, and twice he had been tempted to send a squad back up the ridge in direct violation of his own orders. But each time he had held back, because sending more men up there would only have created more casualties for Doss to rescue, and because something about the way the medic moved, calm, methodical, utterly focused, suggested that he knew exactly what he was doing, even if nobody else understood it. There's something else, Harrison said quietly. Something that's not in any of the reports. The colonel looked up from his notes. Go ahead, Lieutenant. While Doss was up there, sir, the Japanese stopped shooting at him. Come again? Harrison took a breath and tried to find words for something that still didn't make complete sense to him. For the first few hours, we could hear machine gun fire, rifle shots, the usual harassment they were giving us. But sometime around noon, the enemy fire directed at Medic Doss just stopped. We could see muzzle flashes from the caves when they shot at our observation posts, but they weren't targeting him specifically anymore. You're saying the Japanese forces chose not to engage a clearly visible enemy combatant? Sir, I'm saying they could see what he was doing, a man moving openly, unarmed, carrying wounded off the battlefield, and at some point they decided not to interfere. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying the stack of medical records and witness statements. Lieutenant, that observation will not appear in any official report. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Because how do you write a report that says the enemy showed mercy? How do you explain in military terminology that somewhere in those caves, Japanese soldiers had watched an American medic working alone to save wounded men and had chosen to let him continue? How do you process that kind of humanity in the middle of a war that both sides were fighting to the death? Harrison had watched it happen through field glasses, but he still didn't believe it. He had seen Doss moving in the open, silhouetted against the sky, while enemy positions that could have killed him 10 times over remained silent. It was the kind of thing that could only be left out of official reports and mentioned quietly, if at all, in letters home. "One final question, Lieutenant." The colonel closed his notebook and looked directly at Harrison. "In your professional opinion, was Medic Doss's action on Hacksaw Ridge an act of heroism or an act of insubordination?" Harrison thought about Doss lying in the hospital tent with rope burns on his hands and 3 cracked ribs from the final descent. About Thompson, who would walk again thanks to the field aid he received before his legs could develop gangrene. About 31 men who were alive because one person had decided that orders didn't override conscience. "Sir, I think it was both. And I think that's what made it worth documenting." That evening, Harrison walked through the aid station, where some of Doss's evacuees were still recovering. Most were stable now, ready for transport to rear hospitals or return to duty. A few would be going home with medical discharges. All of them asked the same question when they saw his lieutenant's bars. How was Doc Doss doing? Harrison always gave the same answer. Doss was fine, resting, and would be back to duty soon. But what he didn't tell them was that he had visited the medic's tent that morning and found him sitting on his cot, staring at a piece of rope he had salvaged from the supply dump. Doss had been testing the fibers, checking knots, as if he were preparing for another solo climb up an impossible cliff. When Harrison asked if everything was all right, Doss had looked up with eyes that seemed much older than they had been a week earlier. "I keep hearing them, sir. Voices calling for help. I know they're not real, but I keep hearing them anyway." That was the moment Harrison realized that medals and citations and official reports could document what happened on Hacksaw Ridge, but they couldn't capture what it cost the man who carried it in his memory. 6 months later, in a military hospital in Hawaii, Desmond Doss sat beside a window overlooking Pearl Harbor while a Navy psychiatrist reviewed his medical file. The rope burns on his hands had healed, leaving only faint scars across his palms. The cracked ribs had mended properly. But the nightmares continued, and the sound of rain on canvas still made him reach for medical supplies that weren't there. "You've been recommended for the Medal of Honor," the psychiatrist said, looking up from the paperwork. "The citation will read that you evacuated approximately 31 casualties under hostile fire. Does that number sound accurate to you?" Doss rubbed his palms together, feeling the ridge of scar tissue where the rope had cut deepest. "I honestly don't remember, sir. After the first dozen, I stopped counting. It was just, find one more, get him down, go back for one more." The witnesses are remarkably consistent in their accounts. Multiple soldiers describe seeing you work alone on that ridge for over 10 hours, moving in the open while under enemy observation. "The Japanese could have killed me any time they wanted," Doss said quietly. "I think they chose not to." The psychiatrist made a note. "How does that make you feel?" Doss was quiet for a moment, watching a supply ship navigate the harbor below. "Grateful and confused, and like there's something about that day that I'm never going to understand completely." What he didn't tell the psychiatrist was that he had been having the same dream almost every night since Hacksaw Ridge. In the dream, he was back on the plateau, but this time the voices calling for help weren't coming from wounded American soldiers. They were coming from the caves, Japanese voices crying, "Medic!" in accented English. And when he tried to respond, his aid bag was empty and his hands couldn't tie knots anymore. He would wake from these dreams, with his heart racing and the smell of wet rope filling his nostrils, even though he was sleeping in a clean hospital bed thousands of miles from any combat zone. "There's one more thing in your file that I wanted to discuss," the psychiatrist continued. "Several witnesses mentioned that you were observed praying frequently during the evacuation. Can you tell me about that?" Doss smiled for the first time during the interview. "Sir, I was praying the whole time. Before I found each man, while I was treating his wounds, while I was rigging the rope, mostly the same prayer. Lord, please help me find just one more." "And you believe those prayers were answered?" I believe I found 31 men who would have died on that ridge if someone hadn't gone back for them. Whether you call that prayer or stubbornness or just dumb luck, I don't know if it matters. A week later, Doss was discharged from the hospital and sent home to Virginia, while his medal recommendation worked its way through military bureaucracy. He spent the journey thinking about Thompson, who had written him a letter from a stateside hospital saying that he would walk again, though with a limp. About Coleman, who had kept both legs despite the severity of his wounds. About Morrison, who had survived the rest of the Okinawa campaign and was already back home in Ohio. But he also thought about the voices he hadn't found that night. The men who had called for help from positions too deep in Japanese territory, too close to the caves, too far from the rope anchor point. In the official accounts, Hacksaw Ridge was a complete success. Every reachable casualty evacuated, minimal additional losses, tactical objectives achieved. In Doss's memory, it was a night of incomplete prayers and difficult choices, of deciding that saving 31 men was worth the risk of not being able to save 32. 2 years after the war ended, Doss was working as a carpenter in Virginia when he received an unexpected visitor. Thompson, walking with only the slightest limp, had driven down from Pennsylvania to deliver a wedding invitation. "I wanted you to be there, Doc," Thompson said, sitting on Doss's front porch with a glass of sweet tea, "since you're the reason I'm able to walk down the aisle at all." They talked for hours about everything except Hacksaw Ridge, about Thompson's job at a tool factory, about Doss's work building houses for veterans, about the quiet rhythms of civilian life that felt both normal and impossibly strange after years in uniform. Finally, as Thompson was preparing to leave, he asked the question that Doss had been expecting all afternoon. "Do you ever think about that night, Doc? About what it felt like to be up there alone?" Doss looked out at his workshop, where a coil of rope hung from a nail beside his workbench. He used it for construction projects now, measuring lumber and securing tarps, but sometimes when he held it, he could feel the memory of other hands gripping the same kind of line in the darkness above a cliff. "I think about the voices," he said finally. "Not just the ones I found, but the ones I didn't, and I wonder if there was something more I could have done, some way to reach them all." Thompson was quiet for a moment. "Doc, you saved 31 guys that night. 31 families got their sons and husbands and fathers back because you decided that orders weren't as important as doing what was right. How is that not enough?" Doss smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "I suppose it has to be enough, but that doesn't make it easy to carry." After Thompson left, Doss sat on his porch until well after sunset, listening to the sound of rain beginning to fall on his roof. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the voices that had been with him for 3 years now. Not the wounded calling for help, but the quiet conversations of families sharing dinner, children playing in yards, couples planning weddings and futures. The voices of the life that 31 men had been able to return to because of a single rope and one person's refusal to leave them behind. It wasn't the same as the medal citation or the newspaper stories or the way strangers sometimes recognized his name, but it was the part of Hacksaw Ridge that felt most like prayer to him, the knowledge that somewhere people he would never meet were living lives that almost ended on a dark plateau in 1945. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of rope he had been carrying since his discharge, testing the fibers with his fingers one more time before tucking it away again. Tomorrow, he would build another house. Tonight he would sleep dreamlessly and wake to the sound of rain that was just rain, falling on a roof that kept him safe and dry. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.